The fog rolled in from the Seine like a living thing, curling around the narrow bridges and whispering against the windows of shuttered rooms. Beneath its pale breath, Paris never truly slept. Somewhere in the city's heart, a single yellow light burned through the mist, a lamp in the corridor of the Quai des Orfèvres, where Inspector Maigret sat in silence, staring at a telegram that had arrived past midnight. The words were brief, clumsy, almost apologetic. Body found near Gare de Lyon. Identity unknown. That was all. Yet something in the phrasing disturbed him. Not the death itself, but the absence of urgency. It was as though the sender wished the body would vanish before anyone arrived. He rose from his chair, pipe still unlit, and felt the weight of the damp air pressing through the cracks of the old building. Beyond the walls, Paris exhaled. Trams creaked, cafes murmured, footsteps faded into alleys where secrets slept like buried embers. It was a city that remembered everything and confessed nothing. And in its sleepless heart lay a corpse that no one seemed to miss. If you find yourself drawn into this world of rain-soaked streets, forgotten faces and questions without easy answers, then stay close. Like Maigret, follow the trail of smoke and silence. Subscribe, share, and step into the mystery, because every shadow in Paris has a story, and tonight one of them has begun to speak. The rain had started sometime after 11, one of those slow, persistent rains that seemed less a storm than a state of mind. By midnight, the air above the Seine was a dull grey shimmer, and the lamps along the embankment burned like tiny suns swallowed by mist. Inside the Quai des Orfèvres, where the corridors always smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and damp wool, Inspector Maigret sat at his desk, staring at the telegram as if it had come from another world. Body found near Gare de Lyon. Identity unknown. Station police request assistance. There was nothing unusual in such a message. Paris was a city that shed its people like dead leaves. Yet something in the wording made him hesitate. No name of the officer who sent it. No time of discovery. No mention of witnesses. Just the dry language of formality, written as though the sender hoped no one would come. He drew the telegram closer under the yellow pool of light from his desk lamp. Outside, he could hear the faint slosh of tires against wet cobblestones, the occasional ring of a distant tram bell, the pulse of a city that refused to sleep. The hour was late enough that even the clerks had gone home. Only the low hum of the radiators and the shuffle of the night guard disturbed the silence. Maigret felt the warmth of his pipe between his fingers, but did not light it. The tobacco had gone stale. He rose, stretching his large frame, and crossed to the window. Through the glass he saw the Seine winding through the fog like a ghostly artery. Somewhere beyond the bridges, someone had died, and the city had already moved on. He pulled on his overcoat, the heavy grey one that had seen too many winters, and took his hat from the peg. The brim was still damp from the morning rain. Downstairs, the night sergeant stirred when he heard Maigret's steps echoing on the stone floor. "Going out, Chief?" "Gare de Lyon?" Maigret murmured, adjusting his collar. "Telegram about a body." The sergeant frowned. "At this hour?" Maigret smiled faintly. "Corpses don't keep office hours." The taxi rank outside the prefecture was nearly deserted. A single cab waited under the dripping eaves, its driver slumped half asleep behind the wheel. Maigret rapped on the glass, and the man startled awake. "Gare de Lyon," Maigret said, sliding into the back seat. The engine coughed, then growled reluctantly to life. They moved through the sleeping city, past shuttered cafes and rain-slick boulevards where the reflections of lamps trembled like broken necklaces. Every so often a figure crossed the street. a delivery boy, a woman with a shawl drawn tight, a constable on patrol. Life in miniature, secret and stubborn. When the cab reached the broad square before the station, the fog had thickened into a living wall. The grand clock above the facade showed 1:15. Beneath its arches, the station was nearly empty, only a few porters loitering near the baggage room and a stray dog sniffing at puddles. Maigret stepped out, paying the driver with a few coins that clinked in his palm. The man touched his cap and vanished into the mist. A uniformed officer stood under the canopy, his cap darkened by rain. He saluted nervously when Maigret approached. "Inspector Maigret, sir? They told me you might come." "Where is he?" "This way, sir, by the coal depot. We've kept it quiet." They walked along the tracks, their boots squelching in the cinders. The smell of damp iron and soot clung to the air. A train coughed somewhere in the distance, its whistle swallowed by fog. The officer led him to a shadowed corner where a single lantern burned beside two gendarmes. The body lay half hidden beneath a tarpaulin, rain pooling in shallow depressions around it. Maigret crouched, lifting the edge of the cover. The dead man was middle-aged, clean-shaven, with the narrow features of someone once accustomed to neatness. His clothes, though soaked and torn, suggested a certain modest respectability, a grey suit, a frayed tie, shoes carefully polished. His hands were clasped near his chest, as though protecting something that was no longer there. "Who found him?" Maigret asked. "A night porter, sir. Said he was making his rounds around 11:30. Thought it was a bundle of rags." "Anyone see him before that?" "Not that we can tell. He wasn't a traveller. No ticket, no luggage." "Papers?" "None." Maigret studied the man's face, tilting the lantern slightly. There was no sign of struggle, no mark of violence except for a faint bruise near the temple. The lips were slightly parted, the expression almost serene. "Have you moved him?" "No, sir." "Good. Leave him as he is until the medical examiner arrives." He straightened, looking around. The depot wall loomed behind them, slick with rain. To the left, a small wooden shed, door ajar. A cigarette butt still smouldered near the threshold. Someone had been watching. Maigret turned to one of the gendarmes. "Send a man to search the station cafes. Anyone drinking alone, anyone nervous, and ask at the telegraph office who sent the message to the quay." "Yes, sir." The others scattered into the mist, their lanterns bobbing like fireflies. Maigret stood alone beside the corpse, listening to the distant hum of the city. Somewhere above the rooftops a church bell struck 2. He thought of Madame Maigret asleep at home, the warmth of the stove, the quiet ticking of the clock. There was always something cruel in the contrast. The peace of the living and the silence of the dead. He leaned down again, touching the man's coat pocket. Inside, his fingers found a fragment of paper, half dissolved by rain. He held it close to the light. Only 2 words remained legible. Rue Traversière, a street not far from here. A place he knew, narrow, lined with small hotels and warehouses, the kind of street that swallowed men like this without notice. He slipped the fragment into his notebook, then turned to the officer. "Have the body taken to the morgue at dawn. I'll come by then." "Yes, sir. Shall I notify the press?" "Not yet. Let the city sleep a little longer." He walked back toward the station hall, where the light from the café windows shimmered weakly through the rain. The Café du Marché, open all night for porters and railway men. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and the smell of cheap brandy. A few customers sat slumped at tables, their faces pale in the lamplight. Maigret approached the counter. "Coffee, if you please." The woman behind it, stout, middle-aged, eyes ringed with fatigue, poured without a word. When he paid, she glanced at his badge and frowned. "You're from the police?" "Yes." Her voice dropped. "Was it the man they found?" "You knew him?" "I saw him 2 nights ago. Sat right there by the window, didn't say a word, just stared out into the fog, drank 3 glasses of white wine and left before closing." "Did he meet anyone?" "No, but he kept looking at the door, like he expected someone who never came." Maigret watched her as she wiped her hands on her apron, avoiding his eyes. She was frightened. Not of him, but of the memory. "Did he speak to you?" She hesitated. "He asked if trains still left for Nevers at night." "I told him no, not anymore." "Did he seem disappointed?" She nodded. Yes, like someone who realized, too late, he'd missed the last train home. Outside, the fog was beginning to thin, revealing the faint glimmer of dawn above the station roofs. Maigret stood beneath the dripping awning, lighting his pipe at last. The first puff rose in slow, lazy circles before the breeze tore it away. Somewhere down Rue Traversière waited the next piece of the puzzle, perhaps a lodging house, perhaps a woman, perhaps nothing at all. But even before he turned to go, Maigret knew that this was no ordinary corpse, no simple case of chance or crime. There was a silence surrounding it too deliberate, too heavy. He took one last look at the darkened square, where the body had lain like a question, whispered into the night, and murmured to himself. Someone wanted him forgotten. Then he pulled his coat tighter and stepped into the fog, following the faint echo of his own footsteps toward Rue Traversière. The fog had not lifted by morning. It merely changed colour, turning from silver to a heavy, yellowish grey that clung to the skin and dulled the light. Gare de Lyon stood like a fortress lost in a dream, its great clock tower rising from the mist, its windows reflecting nothing. The station, so noisy by day, was subdued now, its sounds swallowed by damp air, a cough here, a scrape of metal there, a porter's footsteps muffled in soot. Maigret moved slowly across the concourse, his collar turned up, his pipe sending out thin trails that mingled with the haze. He had returned earlier than expected, before the first commuter trains began to arrive. There was something unfinished about the scene from last night, something that demanded his presence before it was trampled by daylight and bureaucracy. The men from the morgue had already come and gone. Only a faint, dark stain on the stones remained, and a few curious sparrows pecking near it. Death, it seemed, had already been erased. Near the baggage counter an officer waited, his notebook clutched awkwardly. "Morning, Inspector. The night report's ready." "Anything new?" The man hesitated. Only that the telegraph message came from an unlisted line. No signature. "The station clerk swears it wasn't sent from here." Maigret grunted. So someone wanted the police informed, but not too directly. Perhaps a witness afraid to be named? Or someone making sure the body was found, but not too soon. He glanced toward the platform, where a lone train idled, steam curling upward in thin, uncertain spirals. The fog made distance meaningless, the far end of the tracks disappeared into nothingness. Somewhere beyond it, Paris began again. Warehouses, side streets, the slow roll of carts heading for Les Halles. Yet here, within the confines of the station, time seemed suspended. A small group of workers stood nearby, whispering in low tones. When they saw him approach, they fell silent. Maigret nodded to the youngest, a porter with soot-streaked cheeks and a nervous twitch in his left hand. "You were on duty last night?" "Yes, Monsieur l'Inspecteur." "Did you see anyone near the coal depot before the discovery?" The boy hesitated, then looked down. Only a man standing by the fence, not one of ours. He wore a hat pulled low and smoked a pipe. He watched the trains, but didn't seem to be waiting for one. What time was that? Maybe 11, before the rain started. And you didn't approach him? The boy shook his head. He looked official somehow. I thought he was police. Maigret studied him for a moment, then gave a faint smile. That's often how we look when we're not. He handed the boy a coin and turned away. By the coal depot, a team of workers shoveled soot into carts. The ground was thick with black mud, and the air smelled of metal and damp earth. Maigret stopped where the body had been. Something caught his eye. A faint mark on the wall, a smudge that might have been blood or merely grime. He touched it with his glove. It came away reddish-brown, dried, not fresh. The man might have struggled, or perhaps someone had leaned there afterward. He crouched, lighting a match to see the ground more clearly. In the shallow depression left by the rain, a small object gleamed. A button, mother of pearl, with a fine crack running through it. Not from the dead man's suit. His buttons had been plain black horn. Maigret slipped it into an envelope. From the far end of the platform came the hiss of brakes and the distant cry of a whistle. The morning trains had begun to arrive, carrying workers, soldiers, women in worn coats clutching their bags. The city's rhythm was returning. In another hour, the scene would be indistinguishable from any other morning at the station. Only Maigret, with his pipe and his silence, marked the invisible border between night's secrets and daylight's routines. He made his way toward the telegraph office, a narrow room smelling of ink and oil. A young clerk sat behind the counter, rubbing his eyes. "You're the one who received a message for the prefecture?" "Yes, monsieur. It came around midnight." "From where?" "That's the strange thing. The signal came from a private circuit, not one of ours. It was typed, not handwritten, just 3 lines and no return address." "Do you still have it?" "I kept a copy." The clerk rummaged in a drawer and produced a thin strip of yellow paper. Maigret examined it. The wording was identical to the telegram on his desk. Body found near Gare de Lyon. Identity unknown. But beneath it, faint and nearly erased, was another line, struck through by the typist. He should have stayed in Nevers? He looked up slowly. "You didn't mention this last night." "I thought it was a mistake, sir. The line was crossed out." Maigret folded the strip carefully. Sometimes mistakes tell the truth. Outside, the fog had begun to move, shifting like curtains stirred by unseen hands. He stepped into it, pipe between his teeth, feeling the cold air sting his eyes. Across the street, the Café du Marché glowed faintly through the haze. It was open again, though quieter now, as if the night's memory had settled in its walls. The widow behind the counter looked up as he entered. She seemed smaller in the daylight, her hair hastily pinned, her eyes red from lack of sleep. "You're back?" she said softly. "I told you last night, madame. Corpses make poor sleepers." He took a seat by the window where the glass was misted with condensation. "Tell me again about the man, every detail." She hesitated, glancing toward the only other patron, a delivery driver hunched over his bowl of soup, then leaned closer. He came in around 8, sat at the same table. I thought he was waiting for someone. He ordered wine, smoked a cigarette, asked about the trains. Anything else? He had a paper with him, a letter maybe. He kept folding and unfolding it. Did you read any words? She frowned, trying to remember. Only one. Nevers. And after he left? He crossed the street. I saw him pass under the street lamp, then the fog swallowed him. That's all. Maigret nodded slowly. The coincidence was too precise. Nevers again. The city of modest clerks and forgotten lives. He paid for his coffee, leaving a few francs more than necessary. "If anyone asks about me," he said, "you've never seen me before." She looked startled. "Is it dangerous?" "For whom?" he murmured, rising. "That depends on who remembers the dead." Back outside, the fog was breaking apart in slow tatters. The shapes of buildings emerged, warehouses, the curve of the street, the faint gleam of a nameplate, Rue Traversière. He followed it until the noise of the station faded behind him. The street was narrow, lined with grey stone facades and shuttered windows. A cart creaked by, its driver humming softly. Cats moved like shadows along the gutters. At number 27, a sign hung crookedly, Chambre meublée, Madame Chabrier. A lodging house, the kind that existed on the thin border between respectability and poverty. Maigret mounted the steps and knocked. It took a while before a voice called from inside. "Who's there?" "Police." The door opened a crack, revealing a small woman with anxious eyes and hair pinned in haste. The smell of boiled cabbage drifted out. "Oh, yes, I heard something about the station." "You had a tenant recently? A man who left without notice?" She pressed her lips together. "I've had many tenants, Inspector. People come and go." This one might have gone without breathing. Her face paled. She motioned for him to enter. The hallway was narrow, lined with faded wallpaper and photographs of soldiers long dead. "He was quiet," she said at last. "Paid in advance, never made trouble. Left one morning and didn't return. That was 2 weeks ago." "Did he leave anything behind?" She hesitated. "A trunk. I was going to open it, but there was a feeling about it, monsieur, as if it wanted to be left alone." Maigret's gaze softened. "Show me." She led him up a creaking stair to the attic room. Dust floated in the dim light that leaked through the skylight. In one corner stood a small trunk, locked, its metal edges rusted. A faint smell of mildew and something older clung to it. Maigret knelt, examining the lock. "May I?" She nodded. He used a small pick from his coat pocket. An old habit, more curiosity than necessity. The lock yielded with a sigh. Inside were clothes carefully folded. Beneath them, a photograph wrapped in paper, a woman standing before a river, her expression unreadable. On the back, a single word written in faded ink, "Never." Maigret held it a moment, then slipped it into his coat. The fog outside pressed against the glass, as though listening. He could almost hear the river whispering from far away, the same river that ran through Paris, carrying secrets from one city to another. He straightened, his pipe still unlit, and turned to Madame Chabrier. "Lock the door after I leave," he said quietly. "And if anyone comes asking for that trunk, tell them it was taken by mistake." As he descended the stairs, the boards creaked beneath his weight, echoing like distant footsteps following his own. The morning had brightened, but the fog remained, stubborn and thick. It was as if Paris itself refused to wake until the truth was found. By the time the clock at Gare de Lyon struck 10, the fog had begun to loosen its grip, curling away from the rooftops like smoke. Yet the streets still glistened with rain, and the air carried the faint metallic scent of the rails, of coal, of coffee gone bitter in forgotten cups. Maigret stood on the pavement outside the Café du Marché, staring through the streaked glass at the woman inside. The widow, whose eyes had the dull gleam of someone who'd seen too much, yet said too little. She was arranging cups behind the counter, methodically, as if order might protect her from memory. He entered without haste. The small bell above the door gave a tired jingle. Inside, the cafe was half empty, its patrons indifferent to the policeman in the doorway. A pair of railway men leaned over their newspapers, murmuring about politics. A delivery boy warmed his hands near the radiator. Only the widow, Madame Lefebvre, seemed to pause, her hand stilling on a saucer, before she looked up and said quietly, "You're back again." Maigret nodded, removing his hat and shaking off the moisture. "You serve good coffee," he said, as if that were the reason. "And I thought perhaps you remembered more than you told me." She gave a small, brittle smile. People always remember too much when the police ask. He took his seat at the same table as before, by the window. The glass still held a faint outline where the dead man's breath might once have clouded it. A man doesn't sit alone, staring into the fog, unless he's waiting for something, Maigret said. Or someone. Tell me again what you saw that night. Madame Lefebvre poured the coffee, her movements slow, deliberate. The smell rose between them. Bitter, honest, a Parisian comfort. "He came in just after 8, she began. "It was raining, not as heavy as now, just a drizzle. He wore a grey coat, old but clean. He didn't take it off. Sat by the window. I remember 'cause that's the only table where you can see the station clock. He ordered white wine. Cheap kind, but he drank it like it was something finer. 3 glasses. Did he speak to anyone?" She shook her head. "No, only once. To ask about trains to Never." "That word again," Maigret murmured. Her eyes flicked up, sharp. "You found something, didn't you? You always do." He didn't answer. He watched the steam rise from his cup, swirling into faint shapes that dissolved like thoughts. "What did you feel when you saw him?" She frowned. "Feel?" "Yes. Sometimes a person brings a silence with them. Heavy, particular. What kind of silence was his?" She hesitated, twisting the towel in her hands. The kind that makes others quiet too. Even the men playing cards stopped talking for a while. It was as if he was listening for something. To whom? To the city, perhaps, to footsteps that never came. The words hung between them, fragile as the mist beyond the glass. Outside, a tram rattled past, momentarily shaking the window panes. Maigret waited until the sound faded, then said gently, "You didn't tell me you spoke to him again?" Her eyes widened. "How would you know that?" "You brought him a 4th glass," he said simply. "The mark of it's still on the table. And the man had no money left in his pockets. He must have paid before." For a moment she said nothing. Then her shoulders sagged, as if the truth itself were a kind of relief. "He asked me to deliver a letter," she whispered. "Said a woman might come asking for him and that I was to give it to her." Maigret leaned forward. "A letter? Where is it now?" She turned toward the cupboard beneath the counter, moving as if through water. From within she drew out a small envelope, its edges softened with handling. It was addressed in a careful, old-fashioned hand, Madame L. Chabrier, Rue Traversière, the same name as the landlady of the lodging-house. Maigret turned the envelope over. The seal was broken. "You opened it." "I wanted to know," she said without apology. "He was already dead, wasn't he? I thought maybe it would explain why." He removed the folded paper inside, smoothed it against the table. The ink had bled slightly, but the words were legible. "Forgive me for what I could not finish. Tell her that the river remembers A." He read it twice, then looked up. "You don't know who A is?" She shook her head. Only that he seemed tired, not afraid, just finished. "Did anyone else see him that night?" "There was a man by the door," she said after a pause. Sat for a while without ordering anything, watched him, then left first. What did he look like? Tall, dark coat, hat pulled low. I thought they knew each other, but the one by the window never looked up. Could you recognize him again? I don't know, perhaps. His face was hidden. But his hands, they were clean, too clean for a labourer, and he paid with new notes. Maigret tapped the letter thoughtfully. If this man followed the victim, he might be the same who sent the telegram, making sure the body was found, but without naming himself. Madame Lefebvre's voice trembled. Why would anyone do that? Maigret rose, setting his cup down. Because guilt wears many disguises, madame. Some people confess by proxy. He tipped his hat and stepped back into the morning, leaving her with the empty cups and the silence that followed him everywhere. The street had grown busier, carts rumbling, porters shouting, a woman scolding her child. Yet around the café door the fog still lingered, reluctant to move on. He turned onto Rue Traversière, his pipe unlit between his teeth. The name Chabrier echoed in his mind, tied now to both the dead man and the letter. He walked past the lodging house again, its shutters closed tight, as though the building itself wished to avoid recognition. From an upper window, a curtain twitched. Someone was watching. He stopped, looked up. The movement stilled. He waited a long moment before continuing, pretending not to notice. At the corner stood a small tobacconist, the kind that sold everything from stamps to secrets. The owner, a thin man with spectacles, greeted him with a wary nod. "You're early, Inspector. Looking for something?" "Information." "That's rarer than cigarettes these days." Maigret smiled faintly. A man used to rent a room at number 27, grey coat, polite, middle-aged. You remember him? The tobacconist thought for a moment, then nodded. Yes, I saw him often. Came to buy matches. Once asked for paper. Said he was writing letters. Quiet fellow. To whom? Didn't say, but he mailed something last week. I remember because he asked for the last post to Never. There it was again, that quiet provincial name, circling back like a current in a slow river. Nevers. A city that held the memory of something Maigret hadn't yet seen but could already feel. He bought a box of matches he didn't need, thanked the man, and stepped outside. The sun was trying to break through a pale disk behind the fog, lighting the puddles with a dull sheen. He paused near the corner, watching as a horse-drawn cart clattered past. A woman in a dark coat hurried by, glancing over her shoulder. Her stride was quick, nervous, her gloved hand clutching a small black purse. Something about the tilt of her hat caught his attention. The same shape he had seen once in a photograph found in the trunk. Without hurry, Maigret followed. She moved toward the station, her steps sharp against the cobblestones. At the entrance to the underpass, she stopped, as if realizing she was no longer alone. When she turned, their eyes met, hers startled, guarded, but not entirely afraid. "Inspector Maigret," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I wondered when you'd find me." He inclined his head slightly. "Then perhaps you'll tell me what Nevers has to do with the dead." She smiled faintly, though her eyes glistened with something unspoken. "Only everything," she murmured. Then she turned and walked toward the fog again, leaving Maigret standing in the cold breath of the city that never slept. He watched her vanish, the echo of her heels fading into the hum of trains, departing for places that still remembered names Paris had long forgotten. The rain had softened into a fine, almost courteous drizzle by the time Maigret returned to number 27, the lodging house crouched between a grain merchant's warehouse and a shop that repaired clocks whose ticks could be heard even from the street when the door was open. The facade looked as it had in the fog, a little sullen, a little ashamed. Windows filmed with moisture, shutters drawn as if the building had eyelids and preferred to sleep through police inquiries. He paused beneath the narrow awning, filled his pipe without lighting it, and listened to the city's breath. The sway and clack of a cart turning toward the station, the distant sigh of steam, a dog shaking rain from its back somewhere in the alley. From an upper floor came the delicate clink of porcelain set on a saucer. Small domestic sounds, they always continued, even when Death had slipped a chair away from the table. When he knocked, the door opened more readily than on his first visit. Madame Chabrier had tied her hair more carefully, but it only emphasized how little sleep she had had. Her hands were rubbed pink from hot water and soap. The smell of boiled cabbage clung to the hall with the persistence of an old complaint. "Inspector," she said, and her voice tried for briskness. "You don't waste time." "Time doesn't wait for me either," he said, removing his hat. "May I?" She stood aside. He stepped into the corridor, that narrow throat of faded wallpaper and framed photographs of soldiers whose uniforms had outlived their names. Somewhere a kerosene lamp turned the air honey-coloured, though nothing tasted sweet here. He gestured toward the staircase with 2 fingers. "The attic, please. The trunk." A hesitation, like a snagged thread, then she nodded and led the way. The stairs creaked faithfully under their weight. On the landing, a door stood, ajar. A draught brought the faintest perfume, not cabbage and not dust. Something thinner, cooler, the ghost of violets. He glanced at the gap as they passed. The corridor beyond was empty, a row of doors closed with exemplary modesty. Yet the scent lingered, and with it the image of the woman near the underpass, the tilt of her hat, the purse clenched like a promise. The attic room greeted them with its suspense of dust motes. Madame Chabrier folded her arms. "I did as you asked. I locked the door behind you. No one has touched anything." "The trunk," he said. It sat where it had, the little iron-lipped box with its tired straps. Maigret knelt again, less a policeman now than a large man indulging a careful ritual. He lifted the lid and moved aside the folded clothes with patient hands. The photograph he had taken earlier left a rectangle of absence. The imprint of the river scene remained on his eye like a negative. Beneath the shirts lay a small ledger, the kind a clerk tucks in an inner pocket and believes will save him from the future. He opened it on his knee. Columns of figures, dates, totals that never quite matched. Not theft exactly, but a slow hemorrhage that suggested either a long illness of the spirit or someone else's hand on the pen. Between 2 pages, a rail timetable was pressed like a leaf. Nevers circled in pencil. He looked up. "He paid you in advance?" "Yes," she said, 1 month. He did not bargain. People who don't bargain are either rich or tired. He wasn't rich. Did he receive letters? "A few." I put them on the shelf by the washstand. He hid them under the mattress, as if a thief would break in only to steal his loneliness. "And visitors?" "No one," she said, too quickly. Then after a beat, "No one I saw." He closed the ledger and replaced it. From the trunk's false bottom, visible if you knew Parisian trunks are often full of precautions, he slid a thin envelope wrapped in brown paper, not addressed. The paper had a faint watermark of a hotel on the Quai d'Auguste, a small place, discreet, where rooms were let to clerks who wanted to appear middle class and to gentlemen who preferred not to appear at all. He broke the string and found within a single sheet, folded almost to transparency, a a copy of employment records stamped by a departmental office in the Nièvre. The name on it was that of the dead man. Now he had one, at least for the ledger of the living, and beside it a note in a different hand. Transferred without cause. Do not inquire. Below, another line penciled lightly as if ashamed of its own insistence. A will manage. He slid the paper into his pocket. "Madame," he said, "when did he leave?" 2 weeks, she murmured. In the morning. He took nothing, only his hat. And the trunk? He said he would send for it. Some never do. Did he look frightened? She searched for the right word. Relieved, she said, and then shook her head. No, not that. Like a man who has given himself a reprieve until sunset. From the street below came the clam of a tin pail and a vendor calling for rags and bones. Life conducted its shabby trade. Maigret rose with a sigh. If anyone comes to claim the trunk, you will tell me first, yes? Even if the person looks respectable, especially if they do. She drew herself up, affronted and flattered at once by the work of being necessary. I'm not a fool, Inspector. I know, he said, and meant it. On the way down, he paused before the door where he had smelled the perfume. He rapped, a polite, dry sound. The door opened the width of a palm. A young woman's eye, grey as river water, regarded him. Up close, the violet perfume was less spectral. It clung to the edges of a scarf and to gloves that had never known coal dust. Yes, he tipped his hat. Forgive the intrusion. I am looking for a tenant who left recently, a man who kept quiet, paid in advance, and wrote letters to Nevis. The door closed a degree, as shutters will against a wind. I am a seamstress, she said. People come and go. I sew what they leave torn. Of course. He took a step back, friendly to the threshold. Did you sew a button of mother of pearl lately? Her eye did not flicker, but the gloves tugged themselves tighter around her fingers. I have sewn many buttons. Of course, he said again, and gave the door the indulgence it requested. It closed without haste. He heard nothing from within, not even breath, as if she had learned in another life to be air itself when men knocked. Madame Chabrier waited at the foot of the stairs, stronger behind the rampart of her desk. You will take the trunk? Not yet. He put on his hat. Let us leave this ghost his furniture. Back in the street, the drizzle had grown more conscientious. He lit his pipe at last, cupping the match, and let the first sweet smoke clear the taste of cabbage and damp wallpaper. Across the way the tobacconist stood in his doorway, studying the weather as if it were a sum that could be solved. He nodded when he saw Maigret. Inspector? Going to the station? Soon. He drew on the pipe. First to the prefecture by way of the bridge. He began to walk. The thin edge of the cigarette paper in his pocket scratched companionably against the lining of his coat. The ledger's figures lined up in his head like men at a counter, each with a hat in hand, and an explanation prepared, and beside them the copy of the transfer, the delicate instruction not to inquire. He wondered which office had the kind of pen that wrote such instructions without ink stains on the fingers. At the Pont d'Austerlitz, the river wore the rain like an old shawl. Barges nudged at their ropes. Under the parapet, 2 men in caps smoked and spoke softly about the price of coal, watchful in the manner of men who have never counted on the police except as a weather. He leaned over the stone and considered the current. Paris and Nevers had always shared this water, the one city swallowing what the other confessed. The river remembers, the letter had said. He imagined it not as a poet would, wide, reflective, but as a patient policeman. It carried things along with a slow, impartial back, and sometimes, when a snag caught, it surrendered what it had kept. At the Quai des Orfèvres, the corridors were their usual geography of yawns and summonses. Lucas met him with a nod that contained questions and no demand to place them. "Janvier's at the telegraph office," Lucas said. "He's chasing a private circuit that doesn't want to be found." "Good," Maigret said. "Let him chase. The circuit is less important than the hand that used it." He handed over the strip the clerk had copied, underlined line and all. Lucas lifted his brows at the erased mention of nevers and said nothing that would embarrass common sense. In his office, the stove ticked like an old man thinking. He spread the items on his desk, the ledger's sums, the timetable, the transfer with its officious mercy, and on the blotter the photograph from the trunk. The woman by the river, silhouette plain, gaze not quite at the camera. He had seen many faces that wished not to be photographed. This one did not seem coy. Rather, it looked like a person paying a debt by standing still long enough to be taken. On the back, the single word in faded hand, Nevers, and below in pencil, finer and less certain, the initial A. It was not necessarily a signature. It could be a filing habit, the way people mark their memories by letter when they can no longer afford names. He rang for coffee and while he waited read through an old report on minor irregularities at a departmental registry in the Nièvre. Petty corruption, the kind that does not scandalize so much as tire. A clerk transferred without cause. An accounts column that healed itself with the imprecision of a bandage. An inspector sent once, then recalled. He laid the paper aside. The case that had seemed to begin with a single anonymous body near a station now had fingers stained with ink. Not the dangerous ink of political proclamations, just the patient grey that shuffles men from one desk to another until they are worn thin enough to be erased. When the coffee came, he drank it without sugar and felt it spread warmth through the middle of his day. He wrote 2 telegrams, one to the prefecture at Nevers requesting personnel records and travel manifests, the other to a small hotel on the Quai d'Auguste asking, in language as courteous as a borrowed hat, about a guest who preferred brown paper to envelopes. Telegrams were blunt instruments, but they had the virtue of leaving a mark on both ends of their passage. He sealed each, affixed the stamps, and sent them off with a message runner who received his instructions like a sacrament. It was mid-afternoon when the first reply arrived, crisp and humid from the wire. The hotel remembered no clerk from Nevers, but it did remember a woman who signed with a single letter and paid for her room with fresh notes. She had asked for a view of the river. She had burned a small bundle of papers in the grate and apologized for the smell, as if the ashes might disturb the wallpaper. Check-in date, the evening before the corpse at the station. Check-out, before dawn. The description the porter provided was useful only because it avoided romance. Medium height, dark coat, hat brim angled against the rain, hands in gloves, the mark of a lady or a careful liar. The second reply lagged and then arrived in recital. The register at Nevers confirming the dead man's employment, the transfer without cause, the sums that did not match, the notations that softened where they should have scratched. No family listed. Lodging house of decent repute. A supervisor who had died last year and thus could no longer explain anything. The report ended with a line that might have been written by the river itself. No further action taken. He stood at the window a while, watching the lamps kindle one by one along the quay, and felt the city pass from afternoon to that blue pause before evening, when men decide whether to go home or elsewhere. He put his hand into his coat and touched the photograph. The woman's gaze seemed cooler now, as if the paper itself realized it had been recognized. He thought of the scent in the lodging-house landing, the door that opened only a palm's width, the seamstress's gloves tugged too tight. When he stepped outside again, the office air rinsed from his lungs by the damp. The sky had turned the colour of a bruise. He walked back to Rue Traversière with the unhurried stride that never frightened rabbits or criminals. In the lodging house, the hall lamp had been turned up. Madame Chabrier looked both hopeful and prepared to be disappointed by whatever hope permitted. "Inspector?" "I won't keep you," he said gently. "Only one thing. Did the tenant receive a visitor on the morning he left 2 weeks ago? A woman, perhaps. Violets." Her hand went to her throat before she could scold it for gossiping. "I smelled something," she whispered. "I heard the stair creak. The door across the landing closed. I am not a spy, but the house tells me when a room is not alone." "Mine tells me too," he said. "Thank you." He climbed alone this time, the pipe an unlit bookend between his fingers. At the seamstress's door he did not knock. He waited. In houses like this, silence is an invitation that takes patience to be accepted. After a minute, the lock turned. The door opened a little less than before. Grey eyes again, amused that he had allowed the ritual to work. "You sew what is left torn," he said. "Could you sew a city if the river kept undoing its hem?" Her mouth tilted, not a smile exactly, but something that admitted at least the question's craft. "It depends on the thread, monsieur." "Silk," he said, "or government paper." She let out a breath that might, in another woman, have become laughter. "Ah," she said softly, "then it would not hold." Her gaze flicked past him down the stair and returned. "You should be careful of men who look official even when they aren't." "I prefer them to men who look like no one at all," he said. A pause opened between them, not hostile, not warm. She did not invite him in. He did not ask. He stepped back, the weight of the clues settling, not heavy yet, only definite, like the first steps of a bridge on the shore that has not agreed to the crossing. He put on his hat. On the pavement, the evening gathered its fog again with a familiar shrug. The café near the station lit its yellow bulbs. The clock faced its own reflection in a puddle and pretended accuracy. Somewhere a train to the south lifted its voice and let it go. He imagined the compartments with their kerosene lamps, their stale wool and tobacco, their travellers staring at the glass, as if the night outside were a film they had seen before. At the corner, a figure detached itself from the deeper dark, tall, dark coat, hat pulled low. The porter's memory from the depot gave the silhouette a name it had no right to: official. The man paused long enough to be noticed and not long enough to be questioned. Then he turned and was taken in by the street that runs parallel to the one where people tell the truth. Maigret watched him go without hurry, the pipe cool in his hand, and felt the case tip imperceptibly from the small, ground-level puzzle of a nameless corpse towards something broader that still refused to show its face. The seamstress's perfume clung to the stairwell of his mind. The erased line on the telegram whispered from his pocket. The river, patient as ever, carried both toward the same bend. He set off in the same direction as the disappearing coat, not to catch a man, but to find the place where he stopped. In Paris, that is often the more telling. By the following morning, the fog had loosened its grip on the Seine, but the city wore a new kind of silence, the sober hush that follows revelations whispered, but not yet believed. The river moved slowly, almost reluctantly, its surface the colour of tarnished pewter. Maigret stood at the parapet near the Pont d'Austerlitz, pipe unlit, watching the current curl around the piers, like an old conspirator reluctant to speak. Barges drifted past, black against the water, their pilots hidden behind layers of grey mist. He had always trusted the river. It lied less than men did. Behind him, footsteps approached. He didn't turn. "Morning, Inspector." It was Lucas, his voice muffled by the damp air. "We found something downstream, caught in the chains near the mooring barges. A coat, looks like the same make
As the victims? Maigret nodded slowly, still facing the water. And inside? A ticket stub, Paris to Never, dated the day before the body was found. He turned then, his eyes narrowing. Nevers again. Always never. They walked along the embankment, the stones slick beneath their shoes. The air smelled of silt and old iron. At the edge of the quay, 2 river police stood beside a dripping bundle. The coat, sodden and heavy, looked almost alive as it sagged from their hands. One of them held up a small object found in the pocket, a watch, stopped at 11:10. "Any engraving?" Maigret asked. Lucas examined it. Just initials, A.D., the same letter as the signature on the note. The circle was tightening. Maigret's mind traced it. A dead man from Never, a letter of apology, a woman with violets on her skin, and now the river returning a fragment of the story, like a confession reluctantly spoken. "Have the coat sent to the lab," he said quietly. "Tell them to check for any residue, soil, oil, anything that doesn't belong to the river, and have the watch cleaned but not polished. I want the dirt under its fingernails, not a shine." Lucas nodded and went to arrange it. Maigret stayed, staring at the slow-moving current. The water murmured as if speaking through its own language of ripples. The phrase from the letter returned, "The river remembers." He lit his pipe at last. The smoke drifted upward and was torn away by the breeze. Across the river, the opposite bank blurred into a watercolor of grey. Somewhere beyond those facades was the hotel on the Quai d'Auguste, and perhaps, if the river had not already claimed her too, the woman whose photograph now lay on his desk. He began to walk westward, following the line of the embankment. Paris was waking. Shutters opened, carts rattled, and the scent of bread mixed with that of the river. The city moved as though nothing beneath its bridges had changed. Yet to Maigret each step felt like walking through the afterthought of a secret. By the time he reached the Quai d'Auguste, the drizzle had turned fine again, almost pleasant. The hotel was small, respectable, with a brass nameplate recently polished. Inside, a sleepy clerk straightened at the sight of the inspector's badge. "Maigret, police judiciaire," he said. "I believe a woman stayed here 3 nights ago, alone, paid in cash, signed only with the initial A." The clerk nodded, adjusting his spectacles. "Room 23. She checked out before dawn, left no forwarding address." "Did she receive any visitors?" The clerk hesitated. "Only a man, tall, dark coat, arrived late. They spoke in the lobby, quietly. Then he left. She went upstairs and did not come down until she departed." "Did you hear what they said?" "No, monsieur, but I saw her hand him something. A letter, I think. He didn't open it." Maigret exhaled through his nose, the pipe between,
his fingers cooling. "Did she post anything?" "Yes, a telegram the night she left, addressed to the Quai des Orfèvres." He smiled faintly. "Then it was she who sent the message about the body?" The clerk looked startled. "You mean the one—" "Yes," Maigret interrupted gently. "Thank you." He left the hotel and stood beneath the dripping awning, thinking. The woman had found the courage to summon the police, but not to confess. That suggested not guilt, at least not the kind punished by law, but fear of something larger, older, the kind of fear that survives even the dead. The wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of damp stone and cigarette smoke. A figure across the street lingered too long at a newspaper kiosk pretending to read. Maigret turned his head slightly, enough to catch the movement of a hand adjusting a hat brim. A signal, or habit. When he crossed the street, the man vanished into the flow of carriages. He followed slowly, not running, not even pretending urgency. A detective chasing too hard in daylight always frightened away the truth. The man reappeared at the corner, crossing toward the bridge, then disappeared again into the warren of streets near the Ile Saint-Louis. Maigret reached the turning just in time to see the end of a coat vanish through a side gate leading to the river stairs. By the time he reached the water's edge, the man was gone. Only the river remained, wide and indifferent, bearing away fragments of wood, paper, memory. Maigret crouched, touching the wet stones. Something pale caught the corner of his vision. A cigarette butt, still faintly warm. Russian tobacco, imported, not from the cafes of the station quarter. He pocketed it. By evening, he was back at his office. The lamplight glowed against the damp of his coat. The items lay before him like silent witnesses. The photograph from Nevers, the note from the cafe, the coat from the river, the ticket stub, the initials A.D., and now the cigarette that didn't belong in a poor man's pocket. Each piece whispered a fragment of the same sentence, but the end of it was still missing. Janvier entered, hat in hand. "Inspector, a telegram from Nevers." Maigret read it slowly. "Records confirm Antoine Desbois, clerk, dismissed 2 months prior. Cause, irregular accounts. Believed to have travelled to Paris seeking redress. Associated once with local official Adrien Delmas, now residing in Paris. Relationship unconfirmed. Adrien. A.D., the initials on the watch, the handwriting on the note, the woman by the river." Maigret set the paper down. "She sent the telegram," he said softly, almost to himself. "And she sent him to his death." Janvier looked uneasy. "Then she's guilty?" Maigret shook his head. "No, not of murder. Of something quieter, the kind of guilt that prefers silence to absolution." He walked to the window. Outside, the Seine gleamed under the lamps, restless and old. Somewhere, beyond the bridges, the city turned its face toward another sleepless night. He thought of Adrienne Delmas, her gloved hands, her calm eyes, the perfume of violets lingering in corridors that never forgot. "Tell Lucas to keep watch near the Quai d'Auguste," he said finally. "She'll return. The river always draws back those who tried to speak through it." He stood there long after the office had emptied, pipe smoke curling like memory through the air. Below, the river carried its slow burden past the stone walls, whispering the same line again and again, as if rehearsing it for someone who could finally understand. The river remembers. The southbound train pulled away from Gare de Lyon with the resigned breath of a tired animal, the kerosene lamps in the compartments swinging gently as the carriages settled into their rhythm. Maigret sat alone, hat on the upholstery beside him, pipe between his teeth and unlit, watching the window as if the countryside would confess if stared at long enough. Paris thinned to factories, factories to fields, and fields to a flat grey distance broken by black hedges. The rain lightened, the sky remained undecided. In the corridor, a vendor passed with a tray of hard sweets and newspapers. His shoes whispered on the linoleum like a rumour trying not to be heard. He thought of the phrase stamped on the transfer notice, "without cause," and of the hand that had written the smaller, softer line beneath it, "A will manage." The letter A moved through the case like a shadow that did not belong to one body. Antoine Desbois, Adrienne Delmas. And perhaps another, a man in a dark coat whose silhouette had the shape of permission. The river did not care for initials, men did. Nevers received him in that particular tone of provincial noon, neither welcoming nor hostile, simply proving that it had been here before Paris and would be hereafter. The station was modest, the square in front of it a collection of umbrellas and handcarts. The air smelled different from Paris, less of coal, more of wet stone, and something faintly sweet drifting from the river that lay beyond the houses like a long, pewter secret. He walked at an unhurried pace along the main street, past a baker who was pulling loaves from a black mouth of an oven, past a group of men arguing softly about the price of wood, past a boy with a newspaper bag who called headlines no one wished to claim. The departmental office crouched behind a plane tree that had seen decades of entries and exits. Inside, dust, ledger spines, the patient faces of clerks trained by time to let questions pass through them like wind through wicker. A woman at the front desk raised her eyes and lowered them again when she saw the badge. "I've come about one of your former clerks," Maigret said. His voice occupied the room without raising it. "Antoine Desbois." "Ah," she said, the smallest of exhalations, as though the name had once been a draft under the door. "Yes." "Who dismissed him?" "The director's office." The answer was practiced. She slid a register forward, its pages edged like old teeth. There was irregularity, the sums. Whose sums? His. Not unkindly, simply the line she had been given to reread. He turned the register toward him and considered the columns. Desbois' neat figures, then a sudden nervousness. A 9 that looked like a 6, a total that repeated itself obediently as though it could become true by effort. And elsewhere in the same pages, another hand altogether, rounder, swifter, adding annotations that made the irregularity appear both larger and less dangerous, like a storm described to a child. He tapped the margin where the stamp had bruised the paper. Transferred without cause. "When a man is transferred without cause," he said, "where does the cause go?" Her mouth tensed, not to refuse, but to keep from admitting something that did not belong to her. "The director would know, but the director is not here." "Of course." He closed the register. "And the one who wrote these softer notes?" She hesitated. It was not disloyalty. It was the small courage of a person deciding that truth, in this case, had earned the price of a pronoun. "Monsieur Delattre?" she said. "From Paris. He came for a week. We were told he had authority to regularize." "Armand Delattre?" he asked, because names sometimes required a first name to release what they knew. Her eyes flickered, the relief of being understood without being blamed. "Yes." The letter A again, adjusting the sums with a dry hand and a clean cuff. "A will manage." He thanked her and left her with her ledgers, which looked as if they would outlast sleep. The lodging-house where Desbois had stayed was 2 streets nearer the Loire, in a row of houses which had all been painted the same yellow once and had faded to different degrees of forgiveness. The landlady was thin and brisk and ready to be suspicious. Suspicion saved on coal. "He was quiet," she said at the door. "Paid on time, ate little. I tell you what I tell anyone. Quiet people leave stains on the air." "I'm only here to breathe them in," Maigret said mildly. "May I see his room?" She held the door a moment longer, then stepped aside. The room faced the river, the smell of damp plaster and old soap, an iron bedstead, a washstand with a bowl that had been repaired 3 times and would break a 4th out of habit. He stood without touching anything. The Loire's light entered the window, a different light than the Seine's, less sly, more resigned. On the wall, a nail without a picture. On the sill, a pin with a scrap of dark ribbon trapped beneath it. Violet ribbon, the colour starved out to dusk. "Visitors?" he asked without turning. "Once," she said. Her voice had changed. Memory was putting on its boots. "A woman?" "Not a lady, but she had a coat that tried to be one. She spoke little." They argued softly as if there were a child asleep in the next room, though there wasn't. What did they argue about? I did not place my ear to the door. The words will not enter a mind that refuses them. But I heard the river after, very loud. People hear rivers when they cannot speak. When? A month, a little less. He left 2 weeks after. He carried nothing. He looked like a man who had misread a timetable and remained polite about it. Did she leave anything? I cleaned well, she said, stung by the implication. But the ribbon was under the pin like a thin lie. She made a small cross in the air, perhaps for the sake of routine. The town speaks of many things. It spoke of her too. What did it say? That she once worked at the prefecture, that she wrote quickly and did not miss words, that she used to pass by the river to remind herself it had farther to go than any of them. Her name? Adrienne. The name fitted into the room as if it had been counted among the furniture. Delmas. Then she left for Paris. The town liked Paris for other people. He thanked the woman and left her with her neat room, its clean sheet and its nail waiting for a picture that would not return. Outside, the Loire moved, as if remembering directions no one had given it. Along the embankment, a boy fished industriously for nothing. A dog dozed under a bench in the authority of dogs. The café where municipal men took their black coffee and permitted themselves one brandy at noon was a square of light on a damp street. Maigret sat near the stove and allowed it to warm the damp from his cuffs. The owner remembered faces the way bakers remember hunger. Desbois? Yes. He sat over there, on the chair that wobbles. He was the kind to straighten a wobble by adjusting himself to it. We tried paper beneath the leg. He preferred to make his peace with furniture. And the Parisian? Maigret asked. The one with the clean cuffs, the owner said, delighted. Delattre. He ate nothing, drank without tasting, and left the bill signed but not paid. The department paid instead, and the department does not forget to be thanked. When was he here? A little before our clerk began to look like a man who had an appointment with a train. He met with the director and others who did not glance at him while he spoke. That is a talent. What did he do? What all Parisians do, the man said, spreading his hands. He explained that numbers were a matter of moral posture, not truth. Then he left his cigarette ends in our glasses as if they were vases. Back at the departmental building, the director had not yet returned. A junior clerk with the face of a boy who had been scolded into adulthood delivered a letter, unsigned, that had waited in a drawer for someone like Maigret to arrive. The paper was thin and the handwriting beautiful, the kind that had learned in convents. Monsieur Desbois was not a thief. He was a clerk with poor courage placed where courage was required. I asked him to leave, and he obeyed. Do not require names from a mouth that has only breath left. The initial beneath it was a simple A, drawn without decoration, as though the writer knew that initials were already too crowded in this story. He walked to the river again because the river was easier to question than men. Along the quay, the hotel where discreet travellers stayed had the universal smell of polished wood and secrets. The porter was willing to remember because remembering made him more important than he usually was. Mademoiselle Delmas, yes. She had a trunk with a false bottom and nothing to hide in it. She burned papers in the grate and apologized to the ash. She tipped well enough to feel forgiven. To Paris, then, Maigret said, before dawn. She looked out at the water for a long time. When she turned, she was smaller. He took the evening train back, the compartments lit like boxes in a toy theatre, each with its small tragedy of yawns, a couple who had decided to be silent all the way to the capital, a soldier asleep with his head rolled forward like a heavy coin. Outside, the fields unrolled in darkness. The reflections in the glass made the carriage his only country. He thought of Adrienne Delmas, standing by the Loire, of the woman in the corridor in Paris who smelled faintly of violets, of the copyist's hand that had softened the sums, and of the Parisian with the clean cuffs who never paid his own bill. At a little after 9, the train slowed into the bright throat of Gare de Lyon, the platforms gleaming, the station clock pretending to certainty. Paris greeted him with its used, beautiful face. He walked to the cab rank without hurry. The driver regarded the pipe, the hat, the coat, and decided not to talk. At the Quai des Orfèvres, Lucas was waiting in the corridor with a telegram pinned to his impatience. "From Janvier," he said. "He camped near the Quai d'Auguste." Maigret took the slip. The words were clipped to their bone. Woman matching Adrienne Delmas returned to hotel, briefly, at dusk. Met tall man in dark coat, left separately. She walked toward river, he toward Rue de l'Arsenal. Did not follow both, awaiting orders. He folded the telegram once and slid it into his pocket, where the other documents had learned to live with each other without explanation. 2 directions at once, 2 lives selecting different streets. He stood a moment, feeling the building hum around him with its ordinary crimes, its domestic betrayals, its arguments that would find their way to a magistrate in the morning. Then he reached for his hat. "Lucas," he said quietly, "you take the quay. If she is afraid, do not hurry her into running. I will see where men with clean cuffs pay their bills when no one is looking." He stepped back into the Paris night, which accepted him as the river, accepted its tributaries without remark. The fog was gathering again in familiar corners. The lamps along the quay wore little crowns. Somewhere a siren cried out once, like a woman who had thought better of testimony. He turned toward Rue de l'Arsenal, the telegram warm in his pocket like a heartbeat that was not his. Paris at night could look honest if you kept your eyes a little unfocused, the lamps doing their best to soften corners, and the fog obligingly erasing the stains. Rue de l'Arsenal did not bother to be honest or dishonest. It simply presented its shutters and its quiet doors like a row of men who had agreed to keep their hands in their pockets. Maigret followed the memory of the tall coat to an entrance that pretended to be residential and failed by a degree. The brass plate was discreet, the bell older than it wished to be, the hallway clean in the manner of corridors that are washed each morning by someone who never knows whom she washes for. He pressed the bell and felt its thin tremor run up his finger like a whisper. No one answered. He did not insist. A policeman learns the distinction between a door that will open because he knocks and a door that will open because someone inside has already decided to. He stood a minute in the drizzle, pipe unlit, and looked across to where the street bent out of sight toward the Arsenal basin. A watchman coughed behind a shutter. Somewhere a clock was trying to strike the quarter and not quite believing in its own voice. He turned away without haste and let the city bring him back, by the long way, to the only building in Paris that never slept even when it pretended to, the prefecture. Inside, the smell was the same as always, damp wool, paper, the slow breath of stoves that had learned to be patient. Yet the air of a place changes when a case has taken the habit of it. Tonight the corridors felt thinner, as if the walls had given up a layer of paint to pay for silence. Clerks moved with exaggerated purpose, the way people do when they wish to be seen, not listening. Somewhere down the hall, a typewriter rattled with a zeal not matched by the paper's capacity for truth. Lucas had gone to the quay to circle the woman who feared the river. Janvier was still worrying the threads of the private telegram circuit. Maigret took the third path, the one that led into rooms where dust learned the names of men more quickly than men learned the names of the dust. The records office was open a slit, the keeper of it, A civil servant whose spectacles had grown into his face like vines into stone looked up without welcome and without hostility. A permanent, useful emptiness. "Evening," Maigret said. "Inspector—" The man's voice came from somewhere inside the stacks. "We are closed to the public." "I'm not the public," Maigret said mildly. "I'm the police." He placed his hat on the counter with the gravity of a sacrament. "I want employment records, travel reimbursements, and disciplinary notes pertaining to the departmental offices of the Nièvre, last 6 months, and any correspondence with Paris bearing the signature or the authority of a Monsieur Delattre." The man adjusted his spectacles as if they might protect him from nouns. "Authority is a large word, Inspector." "So is river," Maigret said, "and yet everyone understands it." He smiled, a large, tired man who did not mind waiting, and therefore usually did not have to. The archivist hesitated long enough to consult his conscience and find it happily non-committal. He vanished among the shelves and returned with 3 grey boxes whose labels had been rewritten often enough to show their history in palimpsest. Maigret carried them to a side table under a lamp that hummed faintly, louder when you wanted to think. He opened the first, receipts, petitions, a scrap of ribbon used as a bookmark. He turned pages with his forefinger like a priest, uninterested in a sermon, but respectful of the ritual. In the second box, the handwriting grew neater and the paper better, the ink less inclined to stain. Paris had begun to speak. Letters from Delattre to the Nièvre director, terse, sober, compassionate on the surface, the way a cork is compassionate to a bottle. Irregularities must be regularized without scandal. Resources are thin. We must avoid unnecessary inquiry. Here and there, pencil in the margin, A will manage. He recognized the thin hand from the note in the trunk, the grace of a person who had written a great deal for other people and had learned to step around their mistakes without stepping on them. Adrienne's hand, he was almost sure of it, quietly caging the words of a man whose cuff remained clean. The river had carried her to Paris long before her body had. Her writing had arrived ahead of her, like a careful envoy. In the third box there should have been the small ugliness that always attends large kindnesses, the travel stubs, the meal allowances, the hotel receipts. There were some, enough to be plausible, too few to be true. A gap opened where paper ought to have been. Men are not thorough when they remove their tracks, they are simply busy. He turned the remaining sheets one by one and found a leaf torn by an impatient hand. Half a date remained and half a name. Tien on one line, Mitz on another. It could have been almost anyone and was no one at all. He looked up. The archivist had found something to dust that had never needed dusting until now. "Were these files altered recently?" Maigret asked. The man arranged his mouth into neutrality. "We received requests to streamline. It is a modern word for a very old activity." "And the requests came from?" "Higher," he said, and then, as if granting a child a second sweet on a feast day, "from a bureau that sometimes borrows letters and does not return them." "Which bureau?" He lifted a shoulder. "Bureaus are like rivers, Inspector. They change their names when they turn." Maigret replaced the pages in their boxes. He did not argue with metaphors that told the truth. If a letter were to go missing, he said, but a copy needed somewhere safe to remain missing in case its absence was required, where would it be? The archivist's spectacles clouded with something like amusement. Copies are the conscience of offices, and consciences dislike being filed where they belong. He made a slow, ceremonial turn and slid open a drawer that did not exist a minute ago. From its depths he produced a thin packet bound with twine. "This drawer is marked string," You may verify." Maigret took the packet and untied it. The top sheet was a carbon, faint but legible, a memorandum drafted by Delatre's office, addressed to the director in Never, the sort of document that forgets itself as soon as it is sent. Clerk A. Desbois has petitioned for revision. Recommend transfer without cause to prevent formal inquiry. Reassure petitioner by indicating potential reinstatement. Delay response 2 to 3 weeks. If petitioner travels to Paris, refer him to the Bureau of Regularizations, room 47, afternoons only. Initials below. A.D. in a secretary's hand, not Adrienne's. This was the other A.D., Armand Delatre's, authorized by her pen. Room 47, afternoon. A corridor where afternoons never ended. He knew the room well enough. The Bureau of Regularizations existed to slow men to the pace of paper. He put the packet down and felt the case slide a little in his hands, like a bundle of damp laundry, heavier than its size admits. "When did you last see room 47 truly open?" he asked. The archivist lifted his eyebrows, a fragile architecture. "On Thursdays when it is closed." "Exactly," Maigret said, easing himself to his feet. "Thank you for the string." He carried the packet with him and walked the corridor where men are humbled by doors. Room 47's paint had forgotten its colour and remembered only its duty to chip. The brass letters were polished at the edges by fingers that had grown older while pleading. He turned the handle. It gave, unwillingly, like a habit of mind. Inside, a long table, 4 chairs, a coat tree without coats, a window onto a wall, no files, a film of dust that discovered footprints wherever you began to believe in emptiness. And yet the room had been used recently. The air had the closed smell of polite conversations that had served to rearrange the same words into different sentences. On the table, someone had left a glass ring, and beside it a fragment of ash that did not belong to ordinary tobacco. Russian again. Imported smoke makes democratic rooms smell foreign. He stood in the quiet and tried to hear it, as he would hear the river. 2 men had sat here, a clerk from Never who had learned to fold his hat brim when nervous, and a Parisian who had trained his face to remain interested. Perhaps there had been a third, someone who wrote for the Parisian, and who understood that compassion can slope into obedience if you give it paper to slide on. They had spoken in the language of offices. The clerk had said, "I only wish to clear my name." The Parisian had said, "Of course." The writer had said nothing. At the end, a card had been passed. A suggestion had been made. A place near the station where, discreetly, certain difficulties could be made to seem smaller. Perhaps money had changed hands. Perhaps only time. The clerk had left the room lighter by a hope he could not afford. The Parisian had rung for another petitioner. The writer had gone out by a different door to mail a letter she would regret. He opened the window, stiff, unwilling, just enough to let in the street's cooler breath. A file clerk passed below with a stack of papers held vertically, as if to air their consciences. Somewhere deeper in the building, a bell rang with no conviction, and men obeyed it with the eagerness of cows at dusk. He closed the window and left room 47 as he had found it, present and absent in equal measure. In the corridor, a young messenger was folding a handbill into a boat. He straightened when he saw Maigret and tried to make the boat into a square again. "Forgive me, Monsieur l'Inspecteur." "Keep the boat," Maigret said. "Rivers need them." He handed the boy a coin and the boat, and turned toward the stairs that led to the cabinets where favor and fear go to be renamed, the offices of personnel. The chief there was a tidy man whose tie knew more about him than anyone else did. His smile contained a chair for visitors to sit in and be shorter by an inch. "How may the administration assist the police judiciaire?" he asked, as if offering a napkin. By pretending we are the same thing, Maigret said, sitting without becoming shorter. He placed the carbon memorandum on the desk and watched the man read it with the attention of someone discovering his own handwriting in a love letter he had not sent. The chief had the virtue of not fumbling for lies too quickly. He admired them before choosing one. "This is, unofficial," he said at last. "Only the best things are," Maigret answered. "A misunderstanding, then? The clerk from Nevers was a troubled man. We wished to spare him scandal." "You spared him a name," Maigret said. "He found a river instead." The chief's hands settled on the blotter, symmetrical as a photograph. "What do you want, Inspector?" "Not a confession," Maigret said. "A map. Who brought the clerk into room 47 and who took him out? And the name of the bureau that borrows letters and fails to return them." The man looked at the door, as if it might volunteer. "Monsieur Delattre oversees regularizations for several departments. He consults, he does not decide." "Who decides?" "Councillors, committees." He spread his fingers like a fan. "Inquiries are expensive." "And forgetting is cheap," Maigret said gently. The man's eyes lifted to Maigret's face and stayed, as if the larger man might agree to share the responsibility by being solid about it. "If there has been an excess of prudence, Inspector, it was not malicious." "No," Maigret said. "Malice is rare, fatigue is common, and fear is universal." He stood. "If Monsieur Delattre consults here in the mornings, where does he dine? Men who are paid by the day eat on the hour." The chief hesitated, then betrayed his class with the littlest shrug. "At the Brasserie des Facultés, in the back room, they keep a table." "Do they keep it for his initials?" Maigret asked, "or for the initials of those who join him?" "Inspector—" "Thank you," Maigret said, already turning. He left the prefecture with the sensation that the building itself had watched him, as a horse watches a man leave a stable with a lamp. The night outside smelled of metal and scalloped light, where rain made halos on the pavement. At the Brasserie des Facultés, the windows shone like a promise someone else had made. He did not go in. He waited across the street under an awning that dripped at a rate any patient man could learn. In the back room, beyond the glass, two shapes leaned toward each other over a white cloth that preferred stains to emptiness. One was Delattre. He had the posture of a man who believes chairs were designed for him personally. The other was a councillor he knew by sight and by the kind of chin that gives orders to razors. Between them lay a rectangle of card, and on it the unmistakable curve of a woman's hand, Adrienne's, writing the small, neat names of men who would not look at her while they used what she had written. He watched without seeming to. A waiter entered, conversation paused, glasses lifted, shoulders relented. Then Delattre stood, adjusted his cuff and smiled at no one in particular. When he left, he did not turn up his collar against the damp. Men like that trusted the weather more than they trusted other men. Maigret waited until the councillor departed by a different door. He crossed the street and stepped into the warmth and the polite clatter. In the back room, the table had been cleared almost. A single card remained, weighted by a salt cellar the waiter had forgotten to remove. He lifted the salt and read the card. An address in a neat hand, Quai d'Auguste, room 23 after dusk, and below, a request that had been erased and was still legible if you had seen enough erased requests. "Please do not come together." He slid the card into his pocket beside the carbon, beside the photograph, beside the letter that said, "The river remembers." Outside, the night had thickened for its last duty before morning. He thought of Lucas following a woman who feared and did not flee. He thought of Janvier listening to wires that did not belong to the station. He thought of room 47 and its dust that remembered shoes. He began to walk toward the river, not quickly, the way a man goes, to meet a tide that keeps its appointment with or without him. On the quay, the lamps hissed and the water moved like the thought of sleep. A figure leaned on the parapet in a coat that had paid for its respectability and wanted change. She did not turn when he came and did not start when he stopped beside her. The perfume was violets and rain. "You've been to your old rooms," he said softly. "The drawers have learned to be empty without complaining." Adrienne Delmas's voice was very calm. "And you have been to the rooms that are always full and say they are empty. They breathe too loudly to be believed," he said. "You sent a dead man to a door that opened on a river." "I sent him to a door," she said. "Men opened it." "Names, madam." She looked at the water. "Names are boats," she whispered. "They float away." Then she turned her face slightly toward him, and the lamplight made a gentleness of her fatigue. "But there is one that never floats far. Delattre." "Yes," she said, and the word left her mouth like a sigh that had remembered how to be a word. "He will not confess. He will explain. He will explain until the river itself thinks it has misbehaved." "You will tell me the rest," he said. "I will tell you what I remember," she answered, "and I will tell you what I prefer to forget. You may choose which is useful." A barge's horn sounded downstream, long and low, as if the river had decided to agree. Somewhere behind them a door closed, precise as a signature. Maigret did not turn. The sound could belong to a waiter or a watcher. Paris supplied both on the same street. "Tomorrow?" she said. "Before noon, not at the hotel." "Where?" She hesitated, a pause that contained a life. "In the room with no files and a window on a wall." "Room 47, he said. She nodded once, as if acknowledging a kindness. "If it is open." "It will be," he said, and did not add that rooms sometimes open when men stop pretending to own them. She walked away without looking back, and the fog took her at the third lamp. He stood a while longer, the pipe cool in his hand, the card warm in his pocket, the city turning its page to a margin where ink had learned not to blot. From the water came the smallest sound, like paper loosening in a current. Room 47 was not truly open the next morning, but neither was it closed. The door stood ajar by an inch, the kind of invitation bureaucracies extend when they wish to appear accommodating. Maigret arrived without an escort, coat buttoned to the throat, pipe unlit, but present. He paused before the threshold as one might before a confessional. The light through the window was that particular Parisian grey that had forgotten what sun was supposed to mean. Adrienne Delmas was already there. She had chosen the chair that did not face the door, perhaps out of defiance, perhaps out of exhaustion. The table between them looked cleaner than yesterday, and the smell of Russian tobacco had been replaced by violets, subtler now, almost shy. "You kept your word," she said, without looking up. "I've learned that promises mean less to the living than to the dead," Maigret answered, "and the dead are listening." Her hands were folded on the table, small, decisive. "You found room 47, she murmured. "You've seen what's left of it." "I've seen the ghosts," he said. "Paper ghosts, signatures that signed themselves." She gave a faint smile. "That's how we all survive in offices, Inspector. We sign ourselves and hope no one reads too closely." He took the chair opposite her, the wood creaking under his weight. "Tell me about Antoine Desbois." Her eyes lifted then, grey and steady. "He was good with numbers, too good. He thought numbers told the truth." She laughed softly without humour. In the prefecture, truth is a poor accountant. He discovered something? She nodded. Small sums, redirected, nothing that would make headlines, but it would have embarrassed the wrong man. Delattre. Your employer. My superior, she corrected gently. Employers pay in francs, superiors pay in glances and silence. He leaned forward. And you? I typed the letters, filed the transfers, made the lies neat. We called it regularization, as if words could clean what they touched. And when Desbois came to Paris? Her fingers tightened slightly, a tremor passing through them. He wanted justice, not revenge. He thought if he explained it properly, they would listen. I believed him. Did you send for him? She hesitated. Delattre told me to write. A polite letter, an invitation to clarify his accounts. I used my own paper. It seemed kinder. And you met him? Yes, here, in this room. Delattre was late. I told Antoine to wait. He looked at the walls as if they would open. When Delattre arrived, the air changed. He was charming, as always. He spoke of misunderstanding, of reinstatement. He promised to take care of it. That phrase, he used it often. Did Desbois believe him? For a while. And you? She looked away. I wanted to. The sound of her breath filled the pause that followed. Outside the door, a typewriter began to clatter somewhere down the corridor, official memory being forged in real time. Maigret said quietly, Delattre sent him to Gare de Lyon. She nodded. There was to be a meeting, a last form to sign, a small settlement. I was told to deliver the document myself, but I refused. He sent another. The man in the dark coat? Yes, his aide, a former gendarme, discharged for something everyone preferred not to name. He called himself Fournier. Maigret wrote the name slowly in his notebook. Fournier? He met Desbois at the station? I think so. I followed later, afraid something would go wrong. It was raining. I waited in the cafe.
I saw Desbois through the window. He looked calm, almost peaceful. Fournier never appeared at the table, but I saw him near the exit smoking. Then Desbois left. That was the last time I saw him alive. And you? I returned to the hotel. I couldn't sleep. At dawn, I went to the river. To the river? She smiled faintly, bitterly. To think, it's where we all go when we run out of walls. The water doesn't ask questions. Maigret took his pipe from his pocket but didn't light it. You sent the telegram. Yes, someone had to make sure he wasn't forgotten. The admission hung in the air like a confession half accepted. Maigret stood and walked to the window. Outside, the wall was as blank as truth when no one dares to write it down. And Delattre? She gave a small shrug. He moved on. New committees, new budgets. Men like him don't need rivers. They have drains. He turned back to her. He knows you're talking to me. Of course, she said calmly. That's why he'll deny it. The prefecture will protect him, as it protects itself. You can't arrest a man for paperwork. You underestimate paperwork, Maigret said. It kills more quietly than poison. Her eyes softened, and for the first time he saw the woman behind the witness. Tired, dignified, resigned. You can't save me, Inspector, she said. I'm part of it. My typewriter wrote his absolution. I'm not here to save anyone, he said gently. Only to remember correctly. A knock interrupted them. 2 firm raps, official, impatient. Adrienne stiffened. Maigret called, Come in. Lucas entered, rain still glistening on his shoulders. He nodded to Adrienne with a kind of weary courtesy. We have him, Chief. Delattre. Picked him up leaving the brasserie. He didn't resist. Asked if you'd prefer to speak at the prefecture or somewhere less damp. Here, Maigret said. Lucas hesitated. He's not alone. Another man followed him in. The aide, perhaps? Tall, ex-gendarme type. Adrienne's voice barely rose above a whisper. Fournier. Maigret looked at her. Stay in this room and lock the door after me. When he stepped into the corridor, the sound of his shoes was swallowed by the hush that fell over clerks who suddenly remembered to work. At the far end stood two men, Delattre immaculate as ever, Fournier a darker echo beside him. Delattre's smile was the kind used for newspaper photographs. Inspector Maigret, he said, voice smooth as varnish. A misunderstanding, I'm sure. My secretary has been overwrought. Maigret came closer until the difference in their height erased the difference in their confidence. So was Antoine Desbois before he drowned in air. Tragic, Delattre murmured, but irrelevant. Nothing's irrelevant in a city that remembers, Maigret said, even rivers. Fournier's hand twitched near his coat
pocket. Lucas shifted slightly, just enough for the gesture to die stillborn. Let's talk inside, Maigret said. Delattre's gaze flicked toward room 47. Appropriate, he said softly. The grave of lost correspondence. They entered. Adrienne was standing now, pale but composed. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Then Maigret shut the door, sealing them in with the ghosts. You told him to meet you, Maigret said to Delattre. You sent Fournier instead. You promised silence and delivered a corpse. Delattre's eyes gleamed. Proof, Inspector. We live in an age that adores proof. Maigret laid the packet of carbons on the table, one sheet facing up. The memorandum bearing Delattre's signature and Adrienne's annotation. The ink was faded, but the shape of the deceit was unmistakable. Delattre regarded it, then smiled again, smaller this time. You think paper can convict thought? No, Maigret said, but it can drown men who forget how to swim. Fournier moved first, a flicker, a sudden tightening of the jaw. Lucas was faster, pinning his wrist before the glint of metal could finish its thought. The revolver fell to the floor with a dull thud. Adrienne gasped, but didn't move. Delattre didn't look surprised. You see, Inspector, guilt makes servants clumsy. Sometimes, Maigret said, it just makes them loyal. He motioned to Lucas. Take him. As Fournier was led away, Delattre brushed an imaginary speck of dust from his sleeve. Paris will forget by tomorrow. Maigret met his eyes. Paris forgets the living. The dead it keeps. When the door closed behind them, Adrienne sank into the chair. It's finished, she said. No, Maigret replied, picking up the unsigned memorandum. It's only written down. Finishing comes later. Outside, the bells of Saint Paul struck noon, their sound dissolving into the restless hum of the Seine. Maigret lit his pipe at last, filling the air with smoke that curled toward the ceiling like the river's own breath. Afternoons at the prefecture have a way of repeating themselves, as if the building preferred to rehearse its routines until evening came to rescue it. Yet something had shifted since noon. The corridors felt alert, like a body after a fever when sweat cools and the pulse discovers it has survived. Lucas had taken Fournier downstairs to the room with the frosted panes where men forgot the exact shape of their answers. Delattre sat in an antechamber with a cup of coffee he did not drink, the steam thinning to a ribbon, and then to nothing. Adrienne remained in room 47, a figure at rest among the ghosts, her gloved hands laid on the table like parentheses around a silence she had decided to keep or break, depending on how the air moved. Maigret let the building breathe around him a while. He walked to the window at the end of the corridor, where the light reached reluctantly, and looked into the courtyard. The uniforms there, crossed in diagonal paths, each carrying a message that would grow lighter with distance. He thought of the river beyond the walls, patient as ever, and of Antoine Desbois, whose absence had taught them more than his presence ever would. Then he returned to the room where explanation would try to pass for truth. Delatre's eyes followed him without moving his head. He had the poise of men who long ago learned that posture is a form of argument. The cup on the saucer made a small clink when he set it down simply to prove he could. "Inspector," he said, as if continuing a conversation paused for a polite cough. "Your zeal is touching, but zeal in my experience is an urban disease. It exhausts and embarrasses. Urban diseases," Maigret said, sitting, "have a way of becoming provincial funerals." He nodded toward the door. "Your aide is telling us why his hand reached for a pistol." "A reflex," Delatre replied lightly. "Soldier's habit, certainly not an intention. We can all agree that intention is the only currency that matters." "Intention is the first thing men spend and the last thing they declare," Maigret said. "Why did you send Desbois to the station?" "To keep him from despair," Delatre answered, almost kindly. "I offered him a settlement, a means to begin again without scandal. In my position, charity must travel under an alias." "And Fournier?" "Escort," he said. "Protection. Paris at night is not kind to fragile consciences." Maigret studied the neat cuffs, the immaculate tie. The man smelled faintly of good soap and of a citrus cologne that kept its word. On the table between them he placed the carbon memorandum again, not as accusation this time, but as mirror. Delatre looked at the page, then at his own reflection in the glass of the framed notice on the far wall, where the lettering of fire exits made a pale ladder over his face. He smiled at that face as if they had an understanding. "You wrote to avoid an inquiry," Maigret said. "You promised delay. You made rooms to receive patients and return nothing." "I administered," Delatre corrected, the word softening itself as it left his mouth. "Paris drowns in petitions and survives by filters. You, of all men, should appreciate the difference between a flood and a canal." "Floods carry the innocent," Maigret said. "Canals carry goods. You chose who became cargo." Delatre's gaze narrowed, not with anger, but with the measured effort of a teacher guiding a slow pupil. "You think too theatrically, Inspector. A minor clerk, a minor irregularity, a minor kindness, and then fate, always so eager to assist the melodrama, intervenes with a corpse. You will forgive me if I decline to act contrite for what the weather did." "The weather," Maigret said, "it doesn't tear tickets for trains to Nevers and back." He stood, not abruptly. He rose the way a tide lifts a hull. "We will speak again, after Fournier remembers how to forget you." He left the antechamber and let the door close with the quiet of a decision that had decided only to postpone itself. Downstairs, the frosted glass looked like winter from the wrong season. Through it, he saw the blur of Lucas's shoulders and the single line of Fournier's jaw, tilted in that stubborn angle men adopt when they have learned that shame is a luxury. He did not enter. Interrogations have their own weather, and he disliked altering the barometer once it had settled. Instead, he turned back to room 47. If a case has a heart, it beats where nothing appears to happen. Adrienne had not moved much, the chair, the gloves, the posture that did not ask to be forgiven. She raised her eyes when he came in, and he saw that the grey in them had darkened by a shade, as water does when the sky changes its mind. "He explained, I suppose," she said. "He arranged words into a shape that resembled a bridge," Maigret answered. "He expected me to cross." "Will you?" "I prefer boats," he said, and she smiled without warming. He took the chair opposite, and for a time neither of them spoke, the silence strengthening until speech would have required an apology. You could leave, he said at last. Resign, change your address. People survive by becoming smaller. I have been small for a long time, she said. It did not make me safer, only harder to see. Nevers is far, he offered, though he did not believe in distances. A return is sometimes a disguise that fits. The town remembers, she said, and it remembers poorly. It would make a parable of me. I prefer errors made by adults. He lit his pipe then, not for need, but for company. The smoke rose, turned in the stale light, and became a thin handwriting on air. Tell me the rest, he said, gently. Not to prove, only to place. The night at the station, and the hour that followed. She closed her eyes, not dramatically, but in the manner of a woman adjusting the focus on what hurt less, if seen correctly. I watched him leave the cafe. He folded his letter into his pocket like a man saving a coin he might need later. He paused under the clock and looked at it as if time could still be bargained with. Then he walked toward the coal depot. I remained at the window, because courage, in me, is punctual and brief. Fournier smoked. When I looked again for Antoine, I saw only fog and the lantern of a porter, searching for something he hoped not to find. I did not follow. I did not scream. I returned to the hotel. I chose paper. I always choose paper. Why the river at dawn? Because water forgives, she said. It erases footprints and leaves the feet. She opened her eyes. And because I thought I saw a shape moving away from the mooring stairs, a man with a hat, not Antoine, he walked as if he had learned to walk in hallways where doors open for people like him. Fournier, perhaps, or someone instructed to look like him. It was the way he watched the water that decided me, not fear, accounting. She rose slowly, as if the air had weights tied to it. You see, Inspector, I am not your witness. I am your mirror. You look at me, and you see where the case refracts. If you want a name, it is already in your pocket. If you want a confession, it will be written by someone else later, and archived in a drawer called String. Mirrors crack, he said, and show the same face in pieces, she answered, but the face remains. A knock came that was less polite than before. Janvier slipped in, damp at the temples, the look of a man who had won a small race he did not wish to have run. Chief, he said, and glanced at Adrienne with the brief respect one gives to a stranger at a graveside. Fournier shifted, claimed he met Desbois near the depot as ordered, but that the man refused to sign, says he left him alive and walked away, says he sent the telegram from a private circuit because a body should not wait for its name. Whose circuit? Maigret asked. Borrowed from a committee room, Janvier said. The wire clerk swears he saw Delattre there 10 minutes earlier, says Fournier carried a note with Delatre's hand on it, folded 3 times. Did he? Adrienne asked softly, as if addressing herself in another room. He did, Janvier said. We've the clerk's statement and the paper, creased, damp, and smelling of smoke. And what does it say he left unsaid? Maigret asked. Janvier shrugged. That depends on who reads it. Exactly, Adrienne said, and sat again, as if the furniture had remembered her. When Janvier left, the room resumed its patient breathing. Somewhere a bell rang for a messenger no longer in the corridor. A cart clattered in the courtyard, the horse stamped. Above them, a window closed, the sound like a coin put back into a drawer. Maigret thought of the small chain of choices that had brought them here. A clerk's refusal to falsify a total, a secretary's refusal to pretend not to see, an official's refusal to be seen at all. He saw in his mind the station wall with its old red smear, the mother-of-pearl button cracked along a line that resembled France on an imprecise school map. The watch stopped at 11:10. Objects had their own testimony. Men spoke over them and called it discourse. He stood. "I'll bring him," he said. "Delattre?" Adrienne's voice did not rise so much as meet him at his height. "Yes, here. Not to confront, to compare. A room that turns a man toward himself can do more than the law on certain afternoons." He collected the antechamber with a glance and led Delattre down the short hall. The official walked lightly as if the floorboards belonged to him. In room 47 he paused, registering the chair, opposite Adrienne as one might acknowledge a portrait whose painter one once funded. He sat only when Maigret did, and crossed his legs with the careful immodesty of a man to whom creases were moral. "Madam," he said, courteous, weary, unafraid, "you have given our honest labour a tragic frame. I would have expected gratitude." "For which part?" she asked. "The transfer without cause, or the cause without name?" "Both," he said. "We protected you. We protected everyone." "You protected your signatures," she answered. "They are excellent swimmers." He turned to Maigret, palms open. "You see how difficult compassion becomes when pride joins the conversation." "Compassion is a word that prefers rooms without windows," Maigret said. He nodded at the memorandum. "You could have written inquiry. You chose delay. He could have been reinstated. He became a man whose body the fog could misplace." "Again," Delattre replied, "you insist on melodrama. I regret his death. I regret many deaths. But I will not be made to regret my office." "Then regret the room," Maigret said softly. "Look around you. This table has heard more apologies than prayers. The window has watched men accept smaller lives and call it prudence. The dust remembers shoes better than faces. There is a mirror in here, Monsieur Delattre. It is not made of glass." He waited. Silence moved its chair nearer. Adrienne did not look at Delattre. She watched the door, perhaps expecting the prefecture to rescue itself. Delatre's jaw worked once, a man considering whether a crumb is worth the trouble of a napkin. At last he said almost kindly, "I will sign whatever formula allows us to proceed without spectacle. If Fournier exceeded his instructions, he will bear the weight. I will not. You will find that Paris agrees." "Paris," Maigret said, "agrees with the living. It merely remembers the dead." He rose, and the chair's scrape sounded decisive without being loud. "You will wait upstairs. A magistrate will listen. He may hear your vocabulary and admire its tailoring, but he will see the river on your cuffs, even if you cannot." Delattre stood too, very composed. "You cannot prosecute furniture, Inspector." "No," Maigret said, holding the door, "but you can stop men from sitting." They took him away without handcuffs because the prefecture prefers to handcuff only those who cannot embarrass it. When the door closed again, Adrienne's shoulders lowered, not from relief, but from the sort of fatigue that follows the end of a sentence rather than the end of a story. She looked at Maigret and nodded once, a private salute. Outside, evening was already rehearsing at the edges of the window's dull light. He felt the river in the room the way one feels a draught before the weather changes. Somewhere a clerk laughed too loudly at a joke told softly. Somewhere Fournier began to separate loyalty from fear and realized they weigh the same until the scale is calibrated. Somewhere a magistrate's pen was being filled. "You should go home," he said. "I don't have one," she answered, without self-pity. "I have addresses." "Then choose the one with the fewest stairs," he said, and she almost smiled. He stepped into the corridor, pipe between his fingers, and let the prefecture's routine resume its hum, mice returning to the pantry after the lantern has been carried away. On the landing he paused and listened for the city through the stone. Rain against shutters, a bottle rolled by a careless waiter, the distant sleep of trains. The case had grown larger than the corpse that began it, and yet the corpse remained its only certainty, the dark weight that kept every other piece from floating off into explanations. He would go to the river before night. Some truths prefer to be heard outdoors where the air does not echo. He wanted to stand where the coat had been caught and ask the water a last patient question it would not answer, but might acknowledge. Then he would find the brasserie again and watch the door that counsellors preferred to see who entered now that a chair would be empty. He descended the stairs without hurry. Each step found him as if it had been waiting, the way streets wait for men who walk them often enough to be recognized by stone. At the door, the rain had begun again, thin and undecided. He put on his hat and stood for a moment under the arch, smelling the day's smoke retreating into the city's throat. The river would be darker now. He would go anyway. Paris slept lightly that night, as if afraid to dream. The fog was gone, but the air still carried its ghost, thin veils of damp clinging to stone, softening the lamps along the river. From the windows of the Quai des Orfèvres, Maigret watched the city breathe. The barges nodding against their moorings, a lone tram crawling across the bridge, the reflected lights shivering in the Seine's slow pulse. The river was calmer now, obedient, almost thoughtful. It had given up its secrets, though not its peace. He had written his report. It lay on his desk, its pages heavy with the kind of truth that doesn't comfort anyone. Fournier had confessed under the strain of his own silence, admitting that the meeting at the station had gone wrong. Desbois had refused to sign, had threatened to expose Delatre's network, had tried to walk away. There had been a struggle by the coal depot. A blow, not meant to kill but to persuade, had done both. Panic, then the hurried disposal of the body, the coat weighted and thrown toward the current. The telegram had been Adrienne's doing, her last act of mercy in a story that had forgotten what mercy was supposed to mean. Delatre, of course, denied everything. He had phrased his denials in the language of institutions, careful, measured, symmetrical. To the magistrate, he would remain a servant of procedure, guilty of oversight rather than crime. Maigret knew how such men were handled, quietly, internally, their punishment dressed as retirement. A reshuffle, a new office, a salary that arrived on time. There were no verdicts for men like him, only transfers without cause. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight. Outside, a light drizzle began, scattering the reflections in the river below. Maigret put out his pipe, though the smoke still lingered like thought. He closed the report folder and left it on the table, unsealed. Someone would read it in the morning, someone would file it, and someone else would forget where they filed it. He left the building without telling Lucas or Janvier. Some cases wanted their ending to be walked rather than written. The streets welcomed him in their old way, indifferent, familiar. The wet cobblestones glistened like old coins under the lamps. Down by the river, the smell of iron and rain met him, and beyond it, the sound of the current, endless, unhurried. He stopped at the parapet near the Pont d'Austerlitz, where he had first stood, when the city still pretended not to notice the dead man in its arms. The water looked darker tonight, but calmer. He leaned his elbows on the cold stone, watching the surface shift and breathe. Somewhere beneath it were all the things Paris forgot to bury properly. Old regrets, lost buttons, a watch that had stopped at 11:10. He thought of Antoine Desbois, the quiet clerk who had tried to prove that numbers told the truth, and of Adrienne Delmas, who had tried to make decency survive inside deceit. They had both lost, in the official sense. Yet somewhere, he thought, The river had remembered their names, if only as a ripple, a hesitation in its steady movement toward the sea. He lit his pipe again, the flame trembling in the wind, and for a moment he saw her face in it. Adrienne's calm, grey eyes watching him from across a desk, unafraid of guilt, only weary of language. He had released her earlier that evening, knowing there was nothing left to hold her for. She had left without bitterness, only a quiet remark. Some truths live better in silence. He understood. The city would absorb her again. Another shadow among its thousands, another name that faded between stations. Behind him, footsteps approached. He didn't turn until he heard Lucas's voice. "You could have told me, Chief. The magistrate's finished with Delattre. They'll make it administrative. No charges." "I know," Maigret said. The smoke drifted between them, dissolving into the mist. Lucas hesitated. "So it ends?" Maigret looked back at the river. "It never ends, Lucas. It just learns new handwriting." They stood side by side for a while, neither speaking. The lamps hummed. A barge passed beneath the bridge, its light a faint heartbeat gliding along the current. The wind changed direction, carrying with it the faintest scent of violets, or perhaps only the memory of it. Lucas cleared his throat. "You think she'll stay in Paris?" "She's part of it now," Maigret said. "The city keeps what it needs." When Lucas left, Maigret stayed. He watched the rain dimple the surface of the Seine, each circle widening until it vanished. He thought of all the cases behind him, and the ones ahead, each a different pattern on the same water. Some days it was the faces that haunted him, other days the voices. But tonight it was only the silence that followed them, the silence that outlasted even justice. He turned finally, his coat collar raised against the drizzle, and began to walk along the quay. The stones shone faintly under the lamps. From an upper window the sound of a piano drifted down. A slow, uncertain tune, someone practicing for themselves. It mingled with the hiss of rain, the hum of the river, the distant cry of a night train departing for the south. Maigret paused once more before the steps leading to the water. He thought of Antoine, whose ticket had never been used, and of Adrienne, who had written the line that would outlive them both. The river remembers. He bent down, picked up a small pebble from the edge of the quay, and dropped it into the dark. The ripples spread outward, fading into the vast, patient surface of the Seine. Then he straightened his hat, lit his pipe anew, and turned back toward the sleeping city. Paris breathed around him, weary, watchful, unchanged. It would wake in the morning, sell bread, open cafes, file papers, forget the names of those who had kept its conscience for one night longer. And somewhere, in that endless hum of footsteps and rain, Maigret's own would join them, steady and unhurried, as he disappeared once more into the city that never sleeps.